in the area of access to justice and the rule of law. Just illustrations, and you have copies of our reports just outside of the room, so you can pick them up and go through. They're on the website as well. The first thing that you're told in this field of work, and so many people told us at the beginning, and we had consultations in 22 countries around the world to hear from people in all walks of life. The first thing that lawyers will tell you is, or judges for that matter, is the laws of this country are sound. The problem is enforcement. And you hear that from many institutions as well, many of them right here in Washington. We won't call them, names here and so on. Of course, present company excluded. But they all argue. NGOs even tell you that. When you get down to the heart of it, the truth is that the laws are not all working for the poor. There are many laws. N.C. Saxena in India has written a book just in the food security sector alone, which he calls the Anti-Poor Laws of India. So it's not a matter merely of enforcing the existing laws, while enforcing some of the good laws might help. It's also repealing those which don't work. And I can go through and give you many examples. It's not that governments set up these laws deliberately. Sometimes they probably did, elitist governments. But many developing country governments had the poor, had the best intentions for the poor. But things changed. Let me give you one example from India. These guys who pull these carts, rickshawalas. Rickshawalas, most of them in India, don't own the rickshaw. There's some other guy who sits at home in a little mansion who owns all these rickshaws. And these fellows are working for him. And so they earn a salary every day, and then they pay all their income to this guy who is the rickshaw owner. So the government of India wanted to act in the interest of the rickshawala. And they passed a law which said, simple, clear law, the owner and operator of the rickshaw must be one and the same person. So with one stroke of that legal pen, you cut out the middleman. They can't exist anymore. So that's great, right? We all love that. That's for the poor. The hard-working rickshawala starts to save money now. He's making more money than he used to make. He's working harder. He's much more productive. But now he wants, all he knows and all his generations know is pulling the rickshaw. So he wants to buy another rickshaw. He wants to start a rickshaw corporation. And why shouldn't he? That's how we all make money, right? That's wealth creation. But now he's not able to do so. The law kicks in and works against him. And there are a whole range of laws like that. So it wasn't bad intention, but you need to be able to deal with that complexity. It's not an easy answer. There are answers, but you need to deal with it. So you need to take periodic examinations in an evolving economy, and India is a classic case, as things change, of what laws are working for equity and for allowing people in the broad masses to create wealth, and what laws are not. And as I said, there's a whole book of these things in the food security area on land issues and so on. And the reference is Saxena, which some of you might have read. The other one is, of course, legal identity. We talked about that already. The issue of making the justice system more accessible, language barriers, physical distances, affordability. And we have listed a whole range of issues which many people are already working on, using paralegals instead of formal lawyers. In other words, working towards the rule of law rather than the rule of lawyers. And it's a very different thing. With due respect to all lawyers in the room, if there are any. And that's not my phrase. I'm borrowing that from Thomas Carothers of the Carnegie Foundation, who has done some interesting work on promoting the rule of law abroad. That partnership between lawyers and poor people, rather than poor people merely as the market, needs to change. And we have documented a whole range of alternative dispute resolution methods and so on that are helpful. But the fundamental value that we have added to this debate is that the issue is not merely one of enforcement. You need to repeal the laws. The existing legal system is not working for the poor, and therefore the act of formalization, that is to say that those people who are living in the informal sector are bad, they are merely escaping the law, they don't want to pay taxes, is a very simplistic and naive argument. And in fact, if the legal system were to work for the poor, they would be the first to get into into working with the law, you wouldn't have to push them. The incentives will be there already. But formalizing in the sense that you want to take the existing legal system and taking 90% of the people who are making their living outside of that system and push them to work with a set of laws that don't work for them, that ain't going to work. That's the argument. Property rights. In our work on property rights, and let me just perhaps focus on the added value and move on, because it's been 2.5 years of work and 2 big books written on it, and we only have a few minutes to share with you. So let me focus on the gems here, which so save you some time when you're reading. The issue that we have focused on is property rights systems rather than property. Now, a property rights system is not the same thing as a cadaster or a land administration machinery or institution. It has to have at least 4 things. We have described and defined these in our work. One is the property rights relationships themselves, the institutions that relate people to assets. So those laws, the bundle of laws that are the bundle of rights that people have, that is the relationship between people and their assets, is one aspect of our property rights system. The other one is the governance arrangements in that country. The whole issue of people's ability to hold their governments accountable, to get open and transparent decisions, the whole issue of information flows. How do you get rid of the asymmetries of information? It's like buying a used car. If only the used car dealer knows the history of that car and the problems the car has had, and the buyer has none of that information, then that's going to be a really difficult deal. You're not likely to win. The buyer is not likely to be able to have a fair deal. And it's the same thing. If poor people have no information about this land or other assets, they're going to have a problem. So the whole information flows and the institutions are the second issue. The third issue is a functional market. But we have not talked about laissez-faire markets. We have not talked about markets in which governments do not intervene. Governments intervene in all working markets around the world. This naive idea of a laissez-faire or completely free market is merely the quibblings of academics. Even here in Washington, government intervenes constantly in the market. They better do now, right? With Lehman Brothers and everything else, and Freddie and so on. We all know that we have to. So the market is the third aspect. And then the final one is social and economic policy. You will have to have, if poor people are going to have assets like I've argued before, they will not be able to make those assets productive unless you have other policies at work and you have an economy that is geared towards growth. So social and economic policy is the other aspect of it. It's these 4 elements that we argue constitute a functional property rights system in a country, and for it to be helpful to poor people. So it is not about giving a poor person title to the land and then leaving them to the mercies of the market. We all know that that is likely. Some might win. Most are likely to lose. And while some people were very worried that our commission was in fact going to argue that at the beginning, I had no doubt in my mind when I took this job that it wasn't going to argue that in the long run. And I was happy at the end that all our commission members, including commission members who, well, let me don't talk about their ideology, but mention their names as they're listed. People like Hernando de Soto and Larry Summers, and all of them were able to agree that this made sense, and they have all signed off explicitly on the report. A little bit on labor rights. Our big issue here was we have already had we have all the conventions of the ILO. They're all there. The real question is, what happens to people who live in the informal sector? The housemaids, the same rickshawalas we were talking about, taxi drivers, people who work in the beauty salon around the developing world, and agricultural laborers, and it goes on and on and on. What about their voice and their productivity? Now, this is a very difficult challenge. I asked some of my colleagues in the UNDP offices around the world, like in Dhaka and Delhi, and Manila and so on, and Nairobi. And I said, now, all of you have 3 or 4 housemaids and a driver, right? Now, if you had to respect the ILO conventions, what's going to happen? This is clearly not in your interest. And they smiled and they said, you're right. You're right, but maybe we can afford it. There are many others who can't. They can afford it, yet they don't observe it right now. They work for the United Nations system. It's a very difficult thing. That's the point I want to make. And the arguments we make in this report are going against the establishment. They are going against vested interests, including the vested interests of the people that we will turn to for implementation. Oh, this is a tough game. So we know that this is not an easy thing, and we have argued in Chapter 5 of Volume 2 about some of the ways that you can take in implementing these reforms. But labor in the informal sector has to be dealt with in more innovative ways. Trade unions don't exist there. So collective bargaining doesn't exist there. And it's not easy. Now in the area of in business rights. Our approach in the Commission is that human rights and markets can work together. And our Commission member from India, Arjun Sen Gupta, offered India as a laboratory in which he has written a paper showing how these things are working together. The apparent dichotomy that human rights and markets don't work together is in fact a false dichotomy, or at least we have argued that, and these can work together. And we have argued that in this approach, wealth creation and poor people taking their own initiative to get out of poverty is the only way that they will get out of poverty. In fact, we are arguing about an active citizenry and an effective state working hand in hand with the markets and with human rights, and that there is no, if you like, essential contradiction among these ideas, and that we can go beyond these contradictions. So we talked a lot about business and how people can create wealth, and we went beyond microcredit. We had one of the world's leading microcredit entrepreneurs on our commission, Fazl Abid, the chairman of BRAC. Some of you might know that. Fazl Abid, as many of you, I don't think he has any problems with my telling the world. When I asked him in his 21st floor boardroom in Dhaka, I said to him, Abid, how much money do you have now invested in microcredit in Bangladesh alone? Now he's a multinational, as you probably know. And the answer to that was $921 million US. The issue I am saying, and I think he would agree with me, is I cannot find anywhere I go in the world where a recipient of microcredit has become wealthy. But I can find many instances where the providers of microcredit are wealthy. So it's not that something is wrong with microcredit. They are probably lifting people out of poverty, but just above the poverty line in the vast majority of cases. And that's good work, but it's not enough. And we argue that we need a spectrum of financial instruments that the poor can use and will graduate over time to higher and higher levels of growth and productivity. We have no problem with wealth creation as the solution to poverty. In fact, that's our argument. We have not argued on the basis of the welfare state. We have more argued on an effective state which is going to act on behalf of the poor. In a democratic setting, that should be possible. And so there's a whole range of recommendations on business. Now, finally, what do we do with all of this? How do we go forward? And there are many ways of thinking about how practically do you do this. And the context, the setting is probably real now. You have many associations in which you have membership-based associations. Now, remember that I said this is about empowerment. It's not merely about legal reform. So what do you need in an empowerment process? First of all, people have to be able to articulate their own problems and their conditions, and they have to have information and voice. So that's one, right? This articulation issue. Take that as step one, if you like. Step two has to be that they can form groups, because individually they will have no impact. So they have to form groups so that they can be heard. Social mobilization, well-known process as well. The third area is then to fight for that political space, the redistribution of the political space. And when you have large numbers, you begin to get that political space. And finally, whatever freedoms are won, privileges, freedoms, and rights need to be converted into law so that future generations would have to fight the same battles. And that's the confirmation stage, or they get into accepted rights. They get, whether it's in law or not in law, it becomes at least accepted rights. Preferably in law is what we have argued. Now, with that kind of argument, how do we proceed? I just wanted to show you a little bit about the sustainable livelihoods issue and the assets base. Many years ago, we introduced this into the thinking, and my friends at IDS and I used to have a fight whether I published it first in the proceedings of, it is a book called Poverty and Plenty, published by the Botswana Academy. And maybe that's why nobody had read it. But Ian Schools and I used to, who is the guy who developed the framework that DFID uses on sustainable livelihoods. But anyway, these assets of the poor, when you think of the assets, you have to think broadly, not only of land, but of all the other assets as well. And how might we start working? In an urban setting, we might start with groups of poor people and then understand which laws are working for them, which laws are not working for them, and then begin to build the necessary coalitions. Because this is about power. It's about changing power relations. Waste pickers don't have much power in their societies. How do you begin to change that power relation? And you've got to build broad coalitions for change. You know, I argued in a book in 1995, that empowerment, or to empower, is a nonsense word. It really makes no sense. Because it implies, in the transitive sense at least, that somebody who has power will willingly give power to somebody who does not have power. That is to empower, and that has never happened in the history of human civilization. The only way power relations have changed hands, it used to be only by violent revolution for many centuries. And then in the 19th century, we had other forms of power relations changing. We had the advent of Gandhi, we had Martin Luther King, we've had the advent of collective action, we have had the women's revolution, we have had the abolition of slavery. So we have had major power relations shifts. Late 18th century, 19th century, and so on, in which there was not necessarily totally violent revolution, although these were not all peaceful. The Gandhian revolution wasn't peaceful. Many people lost their lives. And those of you who had the chance to see the film would have seen how many people were brutalized in that process. But the philosophy behind it was, of course, a nonviolent one. So changing power relations is a tough game, and you need to build coalitions for change at the grassroots level. You need to build coalitions for change at the political level, and these have to work together. And that is how you're going to get this participation between an active citizenry and an effective state. And one can have entry points as any one of these groups of poor people living in the informal sector, with a whole range of people who work in the legal field, which is on the other side. We can also look at the rural areas, which many of you here might be more interested in. Begin with poor farmers or fishermen or farm laborers, or a cross-section of these in the rural areas, because the livelihood of a rural person typically doesn't come from any single occupational field. Another friend, Mahajan in India, wrote a book called The Forgotten Sector, the Rural Forgotten Sector, because he figured that most people were focused on agriculture production, and they had forgotten that there was a non-farm sector in rural areas. And many people do non-farm and farming work. And we can intervene in many ways in this to begin action on the way forward. Now, we'll have to understand the political architecture of the country if you're going to do good legal empowerment. What drives the changes? You know, the DFID work on drivers of change, or the Danny Roderick and others who have worked on binding constraints. Understanding who makes the rules in the country is just as important as understanding the political economy. Most development has been focused on political economy, i.e. distribution issues, not constitutive issues. And we are taking the debate that step further to the constitutive aspects of governance, so to speak, not only the political economy or distributive aspects of governance. The state is obviously an extremely important actor with all these coalitions I was talking about who can get the state to act in a way that it's not accustomed to acting, because most states are not pro-poor. So to assume that states are going to be pro-poor or beneficent to the poor, I think is a naive kind of assumption which is not likely to work through. Then a whole range of non-state actors, civil society groups, and membership-based groups will be responsible for taking action, and we have sort of outlined that, including faith-based organizations. I got the 6 largest faiths in the world to come together and meet in New York. First, their scholars wrote a comparison of their teachings, their doctrine, and our report on legal empowerment to show where it was convergent and where it was divergent. We then got their leaders to come and issue a statement of why they are going to support the legal empowerment agenda. And it's on the website. It's on the World Religions of Peace website. So these coalitions are critical, and that's how we're probably going to get change. The multilateral and regional organizations have a role, is an important but limited role in this business. They will have to act in consonance with governments in the area of public policy and in the area of investment and bringing resources to, if you like, to activate or the productivity of the asset reform process that we are talking about. They will not obviously be able to play major roles in the coalition formations and the internal politics of countries. So then, just to conclude, remember that legal empowerment is very different from legal reform. Very, very different. I hope I've made that clear. You know, it's not about lawyers getting together and changing some laws. It's a completely different thing. It's a bringing together of human rights and markets. And while I was the Director General for Governance at the Canadian International Development Agency before I came to the Commission, we were struggling with this concept of what was the true added value of a human rights approach to development, beyond all the rhetoric about, you know, moving from charity to obligations and all nice words. But how do we do a development program differently when it's rights-based in the field? I think I have now have a much better understanding of what this is all about, a human rights approach to development. Systemic analysis is what we are after. Legal empowerment projects are not likely to have major impact. They're going to be around for another 100 years, and the poor will remain disempowered. Systemic change is required, and therefore political leadership at the highest level. And many political leaders claim that they're ready to work. Again, we have outlined in Chapter 5 of Volume 2 how these reforms might actually be done. Let me conclude by saying 2 things. I'm encouraged to see that other researchers are beginning to recommend empowerment models as well. One coming out of the ISS, of which Ruth was a part of the ISS UNDP studies, they have just been recommending this so-called alternative redistribution model. Here is what they say. Because the state-led and market-led reforms have their own inherent limitations, their approach is the following. Build broad coalitions among the poor for change. Broad coalitions among the political directorate for change. Thirdly, you must have public investments and assistance. That is to say, credit must be available to farmers through state loans, and they must have other public investments and technical assistance. And finally, a pro-poor growth strategy in the country. Those are the 4 pillars of a redistributive strategy. You will see, I'm sure, the similarity between these. The last thing I've just seen, just published a few weeks ago, 2-3 weeks, Oxfam has put out a big book, 550 pages, called From Poverty to Power, essentially arguing along the same lines. Looks like we're on the brink of one more paradigm shift. Gee, that's a terrible word, right? We don't want to talk about paradigms, and we don't want to talk about development models. We are all frustrated and cynical about all of this. But the only point is that a bunch of ideas seem to be coming together. which hopefully will help in the development process. While I'm sure, and I know in my lifetime we'll never get development right, I think we have a chance of getting it better. Thanks.